I am going to be talking today about why dogs fight. And one of my main tenets is that it's going to vary depending on what economic context and what historical context you're in. So dogfighting is not dogfighting, it's not dogfighting. So dogfighting emerged in British industrial and imperial contexts of extreme income inequality and inhumane working conditions, in particular in coal mining and chain making. And that this occurred in the late 1700s and the early 1800s. So when we're thinking about pit bulls, we have to go back to Britain. The poverty and inhumanity endured did not initially spur workers into rebellion. Instead, workers developed survivalist games known as blood sports, especially bare-knuckle boxing and pitted dogfighting, both nearly identical in architecture, rules, and regulations. The idea was to bet and gamble on battles for life between pairs. This allowed workers to recast their world as naturally one of combat. They imagined the world as a level playing field rather than one of hierarchies and exploitation. Gaming and gambling allowed workers to imagine a world where one could win if you trained and worked hard enough. Dog pits and boxing rings were therefore imagined in imaginary spaces of equality that dulled their consciousness of their own exploitation and allowed them to celebrate their muscularity and that of their dogs as a sign of power and might rather than as a tool of mine and foundry owners who use that muscularity for their own purposes. So I'm going to make a conjecture that it's in the coal fields in Britain that you get the evolution of the pit. And the men who worked there were called pitmen. This is a map of showing the extent of coal mining, and you can see it goes across Ireland, Scotland, Wales, in the central part, what's called the Midlands of England. So industrialists placed workers in coal pits and let them struggle on their own to survive. Their struggles would come to be represented or represented in the dog pit. There's a lot of similarities between coal pit mining or pit work and dog pit and dog fighting. In the 19th century, you would be lowered into the coal pit on what was called the chain, so you'd be on the chain. This is a diagram in 1842 following a parliamentary inquiry into the working conditions of coal miners, which were absolutely so reprehensible that it could not any longer be ignored by the parliament. Pitmen were chained in the mine pit, meaning they were lowered into the chain. And this is why you can see all these chains here. Chaining was also a kind of important foundry skill and was used extensively in mining. And there was a chain of command within the mines. There was the mine and landowner who controlled the pit work. And then there was the buddy, and the buddy was the person that kind of raided all the workhouses for young children, who got all the labor and contracted them, and then under him, who managed all those people, was a figure called the doggy. So there's a lot of ways in which these miners were identifying with dogs throughout both the way they were treated by the industrialists and the ways in which they were working. Children were used in the mines in tiny narrow coal seams, and this is what they call a putter. He's a young putter. And under number 3, you can see what's called a dog belt. And these children were chained onto a dog belt, and they would crawl on all fours in these narrow seams of coal. Now, dogs may have been used occasionally, but I found some evidence that the coal pit, especially in the harder kind of coal, was too difficult for their paws, and so their paws were not, would get too damaged and they couldn't work. So children were used in lieu of dogs, so there's a kind of equivalence there of dogs. There were also child trappers. They started work at around 8 years old. They worked between 12 and 16 hours a day, along with the children that were pulling these large cargo containers up to 100 to 200 pounds of coal, and they were called putters. So again, you can see the chain and the dog belt. They often had to work all day on all fours. Oftentimes their backs would be scarred and knee would be scarred. And the Staffordshire buddies, remember the buddy is the person getting that labor. Staffordshire was the center of the Midlands for coal mining. They would raid all the workhouses looking for healthy 8 to 9-year-old boys and girls, And as orphans or paupers, the children were indebted to these buddies for 12 years, working as slave labor or what they called apprentices in return for their eventual freedom. Lastly, here's a pit man. You can see this is a 2-foot 10-inch coal seam, so it's 34 inches. When it was narrower than that, children worked. But you can still see that these men had to work under extreme circumstances. And you can see his muscularity. It's required for this pushing. There would have been somebody in the front attached to the dog belt. So many pits had standing brackish water that produced boils. Rats and mice were not uncommon. The heat was overwhelming. Men and women typically stripped down to the waist. And in the West Midlands, that part of England, workers were incapacitated by the age of 40. So they were incapacitated and often died at a very early age. Laborers in Warwickshire worked until the age of 50. So you get a sense of the extreme exploitation that was involved. So mortality rates in the pit were shockingly high, 4 to 5 times that. That's the minimum of the general adult male population. Had to do with lung ailments, explosions, collapses, people getting maimed or crushed. So my point here is that industrialists placed workers in the pits and let them struggle on their own to survive. They had very little assistance or absolutely no initially worker safety guidelines. For much of the 19th century, those maimed or killed might be left to one side to die so that work could continue uninterrupted. No ambulances or doctors. The pit hence functioned as an arena of a kind of like a new nature. It was the new natural, wherein workers were expected to engage in a Darwinian struggle to survive and yet not work against that nature. It was just the way it was. So on your left is a very famous explosion in the largest coal mine in France, and on the right is a coal roof collapse and one of the workers who's passed away underneath. So coming out of the coal pits alive was a victory celebrated and disavowed in drink and in the reenactment of the conquest of life over death through blood sports of various kinds. So in this case, I don't want you to think about pit bull fighting only as an isolated kind of fighting. It was tied to blood sports more generally. The pitted architecture of the coal mines is remarkably similar to the pitted stage of this reenactment of dogs. So the pit of the coal mine is a kind of architecture that is going to be reproduced in the pits that men create. So working class households all had bull terrier dogs. Bull terrier dogs were especially important because they were excellent at rat catching. They also were used for dog fighting and for security of the household. Many miners and chain makers would bring their dogs to work. Dog fighting and bare-knuckle boxing, as we're going to get into in just a moment, were sports played in but mostly outside of the mines and workplaces. This is a photograph of chain makers who would work often in unison, and the sledgehammers and the kind of foundry work they were doing was extremely rigorous, and these men were often very built. So here's what I'm going to argue, and I'm going to take you through some images and see if I can take you along with this argument, is that the pitted 18th and 19th century blood sports characterized colliery or coal mining life. Bare-knuckle boxing was something that coal miners and working class men engaged in. They were the ones in the ring. But the betters and stakeholders were working class men, of course, but also the aristocracy and industrialists. And they were, of course, betting for different reasons. Pitted bull terrier fighting, also coal miners invented the pitting of the sport, but the betters and stakeholders were, of course, working class men, but also aristocracy and industrialists. Both involved fights to a real or ritualized death between purported equals. And so my argument is that the blood sports equated human and dog lives. Both took place in enclosed arenas where only one warrior could emerge victorious, and those vanquished were held in little regard. The language is very similar. They talk about combat, warriors, athletes, gladiators, whether it's in the ring or the pit. There's also an identical sense that dogs and men love fighting. So when you talk with dog fighters or when you read about them, they just say dogs love fighting. And when you talk about bare-knuckle boxing, the men love fighting. There's an identical set of officials: referees, sponger, ringside medical assistants, seconds, timekeepers, stakeholders, almost identical. And identical kinds of rules and regulations dictating the ring or pit size, scratch lines, fight to the end, how to make calls, weight divisions of athletes, and so on. Remarkably similar. So coal miners and related working men, especially chain makers, remade their struggles into survivalist games on which to place bets. Survival became something one could train for, the conceit being that with enough training, one could win. In this way, who was responsible for the conditions of struggles, industrialists and/or land and mine owners, could be overlooked. Isolating themselves in the make-believe world of the pit allowed them to take pride in themselves, their physical strength, and their lives, as well as that of their dogs. But this framing of life likewise blinded them to the systematic subordination and death behind its making. The pit and ring obscured the relations of power, allowing new ideas and practices that equated muscularity with power rather than with their own exploitation. And what I mean is that the muscles of the workers and the muscles of the dogs were seen as something to be prideful of, rather than the fact that you get muscular by overworking in the coal mines. So it's actually a symbol of your subordination, not of your authority and power, because most of the landowners in the aristocracy, of course, didn't have gyms to get their muscles, so you don't see the kind of musculature developed on the elite. The elite never joined the pit. It was the working class. So the working class was very central to the 19th century blood sport of bare-knuckle boxing. It involved many coal miners and those in related fields of weightlifting work. And here is, you can see a ring. It's a very informal ring, but it's the kind of beginning of the development of a formal ring. Although you can see some of the stakes and the lines there. But I want you to notice that there are men in top hats as well as the working class here. So the men in the top hats are betting on their workers, whereas the workers are betting on each other. So it's a very different reason for the betting. And the wealthy often had the largest bets, and that's something that is true in all the contexts of pit fighting. So if we look at this kind of architecture and we switch here to pitted dog fighting, we're going to see behind each dog what's called a second, which is also there in the ring. You have the same kind of architecture, the same kind of betting, although there's more working class involved in this. And this is Westminster Pit, which was the largest pit in London. And it was closed in 1835 with the outlawing of dog fighting in England. But it was invented by coal miners, brought to the cities, and it became wildly popular. And there were dog pits everywhere, and it was typically amongst the criminal classes. And of course, we have to question, why is it only the poor that are fighting? You know, are they identifying with their dogs in terms of the struggles, and are those their struggles in the pit? So other blood sports of the working class included son-and-son fighting, where you would, there was one game called French and English, where two young boys, one boy would be placed on one man's shoulder and the other, and they would bring the boys together and they would fight each other to the finish. And there were also battle royals amongst working class youth. The fighting quote, this is a quote from somebody who grew up in this context in the 1880s and writes about it in 1899. He says, "Never accomplished without the loss of much blood and skin. Sometimes resulted in fatal injuries." And I want you to think about dog fighting, because these are the same kinds of things that are happening with these battle royals. Boys were bruised and stunned. After the scrimmage, the wounded were wheeled to their homes on barrows. And that's not unlike how some fighting dogs were returned to their homes in the 19th century. Men were also placed in ratting pits and with their hands tied behind their backs. And ratting pits, again, are very interesting because rats were, of course, the bane of the poor's existence. And so what they would do is they would get bags of these rats at the ports, or they would save up their rats in bags, then throw them into the pit, and then have the dogs have contests as to how many they could kill in a particular period of time. But they were something that was actually very destructive to working class lives. And you also then have men which were placed in those same ratting pits with their hands tied behind their backs, and they were supposed to kill the rats with their teeth. So again, the same similarity of the dogs and the men identifying with one another, and they cared about their dogs, they invested in their dogs as much as they invested in themselves. And there was also on the bottom image, men fighting dogs, and this is in Staffordshire, the place of coal mining and chain making, where you could demonstrate your muscularity, and there's a parity between the human and the dog. Now, what you find is that in some of the early writings that police feared the men being off the chain, and they would say they were afraid of these men being off the chain. And off the chain is actually the term you use when you release your dogs into a dog pitting fight. They're off the chain. So again, there's this resonance with the ways in which men were equated with dogs. So here's the ratting in the Westminster Pit. We saw the dog fight in the Westminster Pit. This is the ratting pit, same space. So working class men identified with their dog struggles to survive. The dog struggles were their struggles. They fought just like the dogs fought. With the Parliamentary Cruelty to Animal Act in 1835, dog fighting goes underground at different times in different areas. And what's very interesting is the image you have on the upper left is of a pub in Staffordshire in a place called Cradley Heath. And it's a very famous man who eventually developed what's called the Staffordshire Bull Terrier. And he owned a pub. Almost all of the folks who were major bare-knuckle boxers and dog fighters owned pubs. There's a variety of reasons for that. But cellars below the pubs became the most important location for dog fighting in cities and in rural areas, along with barns and other areas that you could close off and hide. And less so bare-knuckle boxing. So you even get bare-knuckle boxing in the same pit where you have dogs fighting. So you can look at that pit, and it really does look like a subterranean coal pit. When you went down into the chain, into the pit, you were working in a subterranean world. And so these dogs and these men are fighting in these survivalist games in kind of reproductions of the coal architecture, the coal seam architecture. So this is the man who owned the pub that you saw on the upper left in the previous slide, and his name is Joe Mallon. British coal miners, iron workers, chain makers in their pit bulls, muscularity and survival was a source of what I'm going to say is white working class pride, because there were no slaves there. The working class was primarily a white working class, and that will become important later when we start looking at a very interesting phenomenon of bringing slaves over to fight bare-knuckle boxing with white workers. So this muscularity and survival is a source of white working class pride rather than an indication of their overwork and exploitation. And so you can see Joe Mallon does not look oppressed. These men are taking pride in their ability to fight to the death, either themselves, in this case his cock, he's a fighting cock, as well as his Staffordshire Bull Terrier. And there was a lot of muscular, manhood and muscularity became equated within the working class. That's not going to happen really amongst the aristocracy and the gentry and the industrialists. You want to have not muscles, you want somebody else to do your work for you. So there's this way in which the muscularity is this very interesting contradiction, giving value and worth to men at the same time it's a sign that they're being overworked. So white masculinity becomes equated with muscularity. Survival is something only the racially fittest, and I'll tell you why I'm saying racially fittest achieve, rather than something that white landowners and mine operators rigged in their economic favor. And again, I'm going to tell you why I'm saying white landowners and mine operators. So you can see the ginormous chains. I mean, we're not talking about little chains, right? So you can understand why the muscularity of these chain makers was so central to their exploitation. They had to continually do this 12 to 16 hours. On the lower part, you see some youth, their eyes and noses and mouths encrusted with coal. And on the right, you see the ways in which these dogs are on chains, smaller chains, in the Staffordshire area. And those are some of the dogs of Joe Mallon. So industrialists and the aristocracy became fans of blood sports, both for humans and dogs, and placed the largest bets. Industrialists at least bet for different reasons. They were not involved and therefore could not identify with the daily struggles and physical labor of mining life, the foundries, and other heavy lifting work. For this reason, industrialists didn't enter publicly competitive bare-knuckle rings or train fighting dogs. They were there to take pleasure in watching the Darwinian struggle of the pit and the ring. The invested likewise seeing these struggles as a force of nature rather than as something of their own making. So again, this pit just kind of takes the reality of the workers' lives out into a little theater as if everything is equal and as if it's a level playing field. So why do dogs fight? Well, let's look at the 19th century Britain before I go on to the next context. I would argue that British coal miners, the pitmen, operated in subterranean pits working independently rather than collectively as in the case of factory work. Factory works developed team sports, which was very indicative of their particular way of working. They operated under brutal and inhumane conditions. Each day getting out alive was a victory. Workers identified with the dogs and were vested in seeing them survive. Dogfights were struggles staged in arenas that spatially and conditionally mimicked the environment in which the pitmen themselves worked, just as did bare-knuckle boxing. The games allowed them to reconfigure the unequal playing field of exploitation at the hands of industrialists and land and mine owners, and into an imaginary level playing field in which they alone were responsible for their own survival. Industrial exploitation, in other words, becomes a new normal, a new kind of natural world that could not be questioned because it could not be changed. Dogfighting and bare-knuckle boxing were ways for the pitmen and eventually all workers and the underclass to forget that the cards were stacked against them. They were ways of making life into a game of play and combat between equals. In gaming their own survival, coal miners could operate as if they were powerful and not beaten down. Much of their fighting spirit was hence directed away from turning the tables against land and company owners and towards one another, including their dogs with whom they identified. So instead of turning all of that fighting energy against the industrialists, fighting for their rights as workers, they turn it against each other and they make it into a game that can help them to compensate or save a sense of worth. We're going to turn to now looking at why dogs fight in the US, and I'm going to deal only with the 19th century. There's different economic circumstances, and therefore there's different meanings of the fight. 19th century pit bull fighting in the United States had many, many trajectories, geographically distinct initially. I'm not going to go into those all. I'm only going to focus on one, as you'll see. There was pit bull fighting in coal mines. There was pit bull fighting as a result of the frontier expansion. There was pit bull fighting in slave contexts. And so we have to understand 19th century US pit bull fighting also co-evolving along with bare-knuckle boxing for similar but different reasons than in Britain, because Britain didn't have slavery, it didn't have frontier expansion, so the uses to which the pit bull were put were very different. So we're going to look at the coal mining, where you can see it's all across the Appalachian region, and if you look at where the pit bull was the most prominent, it was in early on when the Welsh came over into the mines of Pennsylvania and southern Ohio, but it also spread into Appalachia. You also have industry, so in the upper right where I have the word industry, you had workers that were kind of an underclass of workers, both primarily from Britain. You have frontier expansion and conquest, where these dogs were used to get rid of boars, because boars use their tusks to dig up the land, and you didn't want that happening to your farm fields. They were also used against Native Americans in the conquest of the western frontier, and they were used in slavery. So when we look at this, we're going to start seeing these transfers through immigrants coming into the United States from Great Britain. Some go to the coal mining pits, others use them for wild boar hunting, others use them for urban dog pits, and others use them for slave catching. All of them additionally use these dogs for pitted dog fighting. So I'm only going to focus on the one I've got underlined, which is slave catching, just to demonstrate the differences in the reasons for pit bull fighting. How I got interested in slave catching and pit bull fighting, to some degree came out and my interest was piqued when I started looking at these images from Britain. And this is an image from England between an African American and a very famous bare-knuckle boxer from Britain, born in Ireland, Tom Cribb and Tom Molyneux. Tom Molyneux was actually sent to Britain to fight, and he was released by his slave owner because he had won so many bare-knuckle boxing fights for him, and I'll get into that later. And he went to Britain thinking he could make a living as a bare-knuckle boxer. So I started thinking, this looked kind of equal between a white working class man and this other man. In fact, it wasn't, and I don't have time to get into that, but if people are interested later, I can talk about how, in this case, the game was rigged. But I was really interested because, as you may or may not know, in the US, bare-knuckle boxing between African-American men was between two African-American men. You didn't have African-American men initially fighting white men. And so I wanted to know, what was the difference? Because when, Quentin Tarantino's film Django Unchained, it's one of the only popular accounts that actually shows how slave owners pitted one slave against the other as a form of enjoyment. And so you have the slave owner in the back there. You can almost imagine this as a kind of dog pit. But these slaves could also make a lot of money if the slave performed well. And so whites attended these. Slaves also boxed within their quarters, practicing also for their own pleasure, but it was very different from when the white man called them to perform for his white guests. So slave owners also pitted many men against one another in battle royals, throwing money at the one man left standing. And we see that with Ralph Ellison's The Invisible Man. He kind of talks about that, but also William Faulkner talks about that in one of his novels. So slaves were made to fight each other in pairs like dogs within plantations. This is a quote about Faulkner's understanding of this. The plantation owner in Mississippi in the 1830s, and Mississippi was a particularly brutal place, and again, I can tell you more about that if you like, during the 1830s when they were starting to shift more and more slaves into the cotton growing country of Mississippi because cotton prices were going up and they wanted these slaves to really be there to intensify production. So the plantation owner in Mississippi in the 1830s, this is a quote, treats his men friends in the neighborhood to barbarous exhibitions of brutality in bare-knuckle, no-holds-barred fights between his slaves, which he stages appropriately enough out in the stables. There at night, a rough masculine democracy is drawn to these brutal spectacles. The crowd encompasses not only hunting and gambling companions from the local frontier gentry, but also many of the poor white riffraff and slaves, all of whom form a ring surrounding the black gladiators doing battle. The events are akin to cockfights or dogfights, blood sports that were common forms of recreation on the southern frontier. So that's not my equation. This is from somebody who was actually living, came out of Mississippi. So like dogs, they were also chained. Charles Baugh, a slave, remembered the trek from eastern slave country to Mississippi as part of that influx of new labor to work in cotton fields. The women were lashed together with rope halters around their necks. On the men, a strong iron collar was fitted around each of the necks. In addition, we were handcuffed in pairs with iron staples and bolts with a short chain, a foot long, uniting the handcuffs and their wearers in pairs. The slaves dreaded the westward journey. Now, what's interesting is that while slave owners were putting their men together, the slave men together in these blood sports, these bare-knuckle boxing, fights to the death, they also pitted these dogs, and we'll see in a minute, but they also used them to catch slaves. Now, bloodhounds would follow the scent. With professional slave bounty hunters, they found the bull terrier. in particular to be extremely useful because they can climb trees. You may not know this. You can go to YouTube and go, pit bulls climb trees, and you'll get lots of people pridefully showing how their dogs can climb trees. So the reason that's important is because when slaves were running away, they would often climb into trees, and you'll see a lot of slave narratives talking about how they climbed into trees, how the slave owner or the bounty hunter would, either shoot them out of the trees if it was dead or alive, or send their dogs up, or what have you. But also the pit bull was used to maul the slave once he came down as a form of punishment. They also put them in pits. So Southerners likewise pitted bull terriers for their own viewing pleasure, just as they pitted slaves. Thus, white slave owners could identify with pit bulls only to the extent that they kept the slaves in check. So it's a very different kind of identification with these dogs. It's not that they consider themselves fighting like the dogs, that they identify themselves with the muscularity of the dogs. They actually identify these dogs as tools of their own supremacy. And we can see that a little bit in some of the pit bull websites and kind of popular media. This one is on a pit bull site, a breeding site, but they have a store where you can buy items that you can click on a link, and this is called the Pit Bull and Rebel Wear store with a Confederate flag and a pit bull on the boar. But underneath it kind of says menacingly, stuff for pit bull lovers, hunters, and proud Southerners. So, why do dogs fight in 19th century slaveholding? U.S. plantation owners and whites used dogs to keep slaves in check. The dogs were positioned as tools that aided in subordinating slave persons. While slaves labored under brutal and inhumane conditions, there was little sense that they identified with the dogs. Fighting dogs were primarily a racial prerogative for whites. White men demonstrated their masculinity by being able to make the dogs, or black men, fight for their own entertainment. Hence, it was the supremacists that identified with the dogs, but only as instruments of their own power. Dog fighting established white men's place in the racial hierarchy. Dogs and slaves were kept in chains and fought when corralled by white men to do so. The emphasis was on who could be made to be in that box versus who made the box. Meanwhile, white bare-knuckle boxing was a source of racial pride. Those working class persons invested in it, identifying with the dogs, as in the case of Britain, and I can explain that later if you have questions. In fact, there was a way in which those folks, after slavery, the way you ridiculed African American men was to say they couldn't hold a proper dog fight, that they were buffoons, that they couldn't be manly enough. And it's very similar to some of the racist propaganda that came out about black men not being able to truly be able to vote because they didn't have the kind of manlyhood that was required. They were still kind of boys. And so this is coming after Reconstruction. This is post-Reconstruction, a lot of racial hatred emerging in the United States after the end of slavery. So 25 years after slavery, Currier and Ives, who we normally think of as this very kind of innocent set of cartoons, ridicules African American men for not being manly enough to hold a proper dog fight. It's the end of Reconstruction, the rise of lynchings, and the rise of the KKK. And this is a whole series. I'll show you several of them. Again, kind of making it look very buffoon-like. It's kind of like Westminster Pit, but not quite. It's obviously, they can't do it. And here at the end is you have the dog being carried in the wheelbarrow, and their clothes are torn, and they're obviously, just don't know how to do it. In 1901, we still see the ways in which white supremacy uses the pit bull fight. There's some ideas that the KKK would use those fights as a kind of fundraising venue. But we also have isolated news reports. So this is from Virginia in 1901. John Wow forced a 15-year-old Negro to fight a pit bull dog by threatening him with death. The dog was turned loose and the boy's hands were badly chewed up. We also see in the World War I how the United States imagined itself as a white fighting pit bull. Those ears are clipped for fighting. And initially, from 1914 to 1917, we were neutral. So it says, I'm neutral, but not afraid of any of them. And so it portrays all of the other states through dogs. But of course, the United States is the bigger, imperial, white, fighting dog, not quite ready to engage. So they call him the American Bull Terrier. And again, during neutrality, you see him as this dog that, is ready to fight, kind of jauntily with the Star-Spangled Banner, watchful waiting. And when we go into war, they put the dog in military gear, in US Navy gear. And again, now he's going to go and fight. After the war, we hear a lot about the Red Summer in the United States, where all across the United States there were major race riots because a lot of African American men were not so happy about being in the war, coming back and being put back in their place. And a lot of whites resented the fact that African Americans were starting to gain authority and power. So there were a lot of white riots against black folk in the summer of 1919. That summer, in Vicksburg, Mississippi, a few days ago, thousands of white men and women dug a hole in the ground and buried a colored man, all but his head, and then after tantalizing a vicious pit bull dog to a frenzied state, put him in the iron cage that covered the head of the doomed man, and then danced with delight while the maddened brute tore the man's tongue and eyes out and likewise scalped him. This is also the time of the resurgence of the KKK. We get a second emergence of the KKK after World War II, after World War I. Then again, we see this dog. Now, this is a little bit of a different dog. I can explain the difference to you later, but it's still considered a fighting dog. It's General Patton's Willie. In World War II, so it's General Patton's best friend. It went all over the battlefields with him, and again, this association of fighting might, the United States, and the Pit Bull Terrier, a fighting, combative kind of place. So I want to kind of jump, because I know I don't have a lot of time. I'm more than happy to talk about what happens in between, but I want to kind of jump to look at what's going on in contemporary United States. I'm sure a lot of you came here thinking that we would be talking about dogfighting today. And I do want to kind of broach that topic a little bit, and I'm going to just talk about the 1980s, because that's when you get a resurgence of it. But for the first time, I want to stress that, for the first time it enters the Latino and African American community. Actually in the 70s and the 80s, but I'm going to focus on the 80s. It's the Latino population gets involved primarily in the 70s, and the African American in the 1980s. And so I want to look at that in terms of, again, the economics of it. How do we understand this in economic terms? Just like coal mining, slave holding, what's going on today that's causing this or that is associated with? So I want to argue that with the advent of the Reagan administration, the federal government's commitment to all forms of housing assistance to Americans waned. Federal money to finance construction was reduced from $4 billion in 1981 to $400 million in 1987. Net increases in the number of persons living at or below the poverty line. During his first tenure as president, it went from 26 million to 36 million. Federal housing programs, this is a quote, have taken a beating from the Reagan Revolution. The housing budget was cut by more than 3/4, from $30 billion to $7.9 billion. And so there's what we call the beginnings of this incredible impoverishment of the general, already the marginalized. And so you begin to see the development of crack cocaine moving in the 1980s, precisely at the time of greatest poverty, working, I should say actually, moving eastward from LA. It was late at night when I was doing this. So it moves eastward from LA, and it's done with CIA support, as we know from the Anticruelty. This is the period of time, if we look between 80 and 90, we're getting white unemployment versus black unemployment. We see that black unemployment peaks in 83 to above 20%. And so there's this survivalist kind of mentality. How are people going to cope? How are they going to survive? And so pit bulls begin to guard crack houses and other parallel economy establishments. Pitted dogfights also become an arena for drug and arms dealing and prostitution, which become a way for the marginalized to develop a shadow economy of survival. It's the same kind of survivalism, but in the context of the United States in the 1990s. And so you look at all this boarded up housing, all of the, related directly, when you think of crack houses, this is a direct reflection of the incredible divestment in housing for the homeless. So the crack house becomes the new kind of housing. So why do dogs fight in 21st century neoliberalism? Dogfighting arenas have always been places where the poor and disenfranchised can gamble as if the cards were not stacked against them in a bigger scheme of things. They identify with the dogs. Today, the marginalized and poor in cities pit dogs against one another as do those living in rural areas. The economics involved are varied. And I should note that today still, the largest bettors and the majority of folks involved are primarily white folk, but there's now this new component that has to do with the rise of the drug trade and that kind of parallel economy, the survivalist economy. The crack economy emerged as a new kind of hustle in the 1980s in the face of economic extinction. There was money to be made through the exploitation of others, which is the basis of all capitalism. The crack economy is a shadow economy of the dispossessed. The crack economy represents the soul of global capitalism, as does dogfighting, and neoliberalism generally. It is based on ruthless competition for the sake of profit, regardless of who or what dies, and it assumes that there's a level playing field. So how do we stop dogfighting? I would say that we need to challenge the economic logics that rely on race-based exploitative labor hierarchies and that make participants feel as if they have achieved manhood. And this is just some of the later ones talking about the pit of stock, the pits where you do stock trading, thank you, the trading floor. And also this new kind of mixed martial arts, which I see as the new parallel for this kind of extreme way in which, crack and arms dealing, drug and arms dealing is a kind of extreme expression of the poverty in this world. And I think that the emergence of this new extreme sports is the kind of parallel to bare-knuckle boxing, as is the trading pit. Thank you.
So we do have time for a few questions. We have 2 microphones that we can move around the room, so please raise your hand and we'll come to you with a microphone.
So in your slide where you had the crack houses, pit bulls using to guard crack houses, I wasn't quite sure. That makes sense. That seems logical. How do we go from that to pitted dog fights? It doesn't seem there's a logical connection, but maybe you can explain how those one
the pitted dog fights. The pitted dog fights are also arenas where these drug dealers will have. There's drug dealing going on. It's kind of like a Las Vegas, where instead of the tables, when you're at the tables, they're also serving beer. There's prostitution. There's all kinds of arms dealing, drug dealing. But instead of those casino tables, it's dogfighting. And so the crack economy is is the entry point of drugs and the pit bull into these kinds of arenas. What I'm saying is that African Americans began to use them for their own purposes with their hyper-marginalization and the creation of a different kind of survivalist economy. And you needed guards for the crack houses, as well as their stashes, as well as their other kinds of places that needed to be secured. And right now, pit bulls are also in a lot of the marijuana fields, and that's happened after the Reagan era, when Reagan did this war on drugs and shut down the border between Mexico and the United States, which then just incentivized people to grow marijuana in the United States. And more recently, a lot of the drug traffickers have gotten involved in massive marijuana fields in our national and state parks. And they use those dogs to guard the perimeter. And because a lot of Latinos were initially involved in the orchards and other kinds of growing. They also took care of the dogs, and they began also to dogfight. It's a very complicated story, but they're always being used for something. They're tied to an economy as well as the pit.
You spoke about the exploitation and destruction of these animals in a political, economic context. Could you tell us a little bit about the breeding side? I mean, the entry point where these animals come from?
Well, it's really complicated. You know, people that breed the pit bulls are so proud of the lineages, and there are so many different kinds of lineages. Basically, you know, it's a Mastiff with a Bulldog with a Terrier, and they're titrated, and sometimes there's a Dalmatian, or, you know, there's like all these different breeds that they can bring in. And the one that we saw with General Patton, that comes out of primarily out of a breeding in Birmingham, England, whereas the Staffordshire one comes out of Staffordshire. But I'm not sure what you're asking. But when they're brought here, then they begin to be bred into all different kinds. There's the American Staffordshire Bull Terrier. There's the American Pit Bull Terrier. And also what's interesting is that a new institution emerges, like the American Kennel Club, but it's the UKC, United Kennel Club, which is very angry that their fighting dogs are not allowed in the show ring, so they create their own establishment, show their own show dogs, although then eventually they don't use them any longer for pit bull fighting. But so there's both those that are breeding them for their looks of fighting, and I didn't really get into that, but there's an attempt now, well actually since the 1860s, to have dogs that you can purchase that look like the bully dogs, that look like they can just bite your hand off. So it also has been reduced to a look, but of course these dogs their architecture is very powerful. So it's not, you know, you can't just, people are breeding them for looks and thinking that they will empower you by the look, but there's problems with that in terms of public safety.
We're going to take a question on your right.
Hi, I'm a criminologist, so I'm interested in this from an academic perspective, but I'm also on the board of Safe Humane Chicago, which runs the court case dog program that Heather mentioned earlier. And so from a more policy and practical perspective, I wonder how we replace the reproduction of exploitation that you're describing with compassion. You know, and if you saw any effect of the anti-cruelty laws, I think you said 1835, if that had any effect on mitigating some of this activity.
Well, here's the thing, is anti-cruelty laws are usually done by elites. And in the case of England, and in the case of the United States, it pushed dog fighting into rural areas. As long as you still have poverty, you're still going to have it. You have to eliminate poverty. You have to have, you know, justice. So in the United States, what happened is it used to be in England, in Boston and New York were major centers. And when there was this one guy, Harry Berger, who was like pursuing these dog fighters, and they'd be like, you know, we had a dog fight and Harry Berger didn't show up, and it was so great. And they would have special train tickets, and they would have, you know, meet in these. But when he started to become a problem, they started going out to Long Island. They started going out into, you know, rural places, just like when they cut down the border between Mexico and the United States. It just incentivized them to go into the United States. So there has to be some ability to recognize that you got to deal with the poverty.
Right. So how does Michael Vick fit into all of this? Because he's an African American male, but he also holds a really high place in society. He's a famous football player. He's wealthy. So how does he fit into context of it being sort of like something that marginalized people are doing?
That's a really good question, and I have him shown here, right? I think today, in countries like the United States, there's been a lot of talk about a crisis of masculinity. And why do they talk about that? Because all of the steel jobs, the heavy industry jobs have gone to China, gone to Mexico, have moved elsewhere. And so men are being drawn into the service sector, they're being drawn into banking, finance, and so on. And there's a big gap now between the impoverished who are emptying the garbage cans and the wealthy who are in insurance, banking, trading, and so on. So there's been this kind of notion that there's this crisis in masculinity, that, how do we become masculine like in the olden days? And some people have referred to it as a surplus masculinity. And I think that some of this is compensatory. I'm surprised. Oh, here, you see Pitbull here, one of the major, a singer as well. I tried to look at it across this domain where everyone's trying to be hyper-masculine. And on the one hand, it's an attempt to kind of be a man in a world where it's increasingly difficult to be that way as it was in the past. On the other hand, I think that the global economy has become in many ways more brutal and more alienating. So I'm going to have to defer answering that question because I think I really have to interview him. I want to know, does he identify with the dogs? Because when you think about the NFL, you think about owners of teams. Is there a way in which football, unlike basketball, is really a contact kind of gladiatorial? And so I'm wondering, is he identifying as a gladiator? Because usually it's white owners and black players in a number of different fields. I don't know. I'd have to really tease those things out. What was he doing? I want to know what he's doing. And I don't think necessarily because he's wealthy that he's an elite. Within the United States, he's still an African-American man. So I don't know. It's a very interesting dilemma. And I'd like to really track things really carefully before I would say anything.
We're just about out of time. We have time for one more question.
I'd just like to say one thing. I think that I owned an American Bull Terrier. I lived on an island. And this dog had been brutalized and thrown on the island as a puppy. She had a broken spirit. She had infections. But my husband took her to a vet. She is the most loyal, loving. I think it's a misapplication to condemn the breed. The breed is fine. It's the owners that are bad. I've seen really great pit bulls in dog parks. They're very sweet, but good owners. And it's the man or the woman that abuses them, not the breed.
Oh, I would never say. What I'm saying is that you could also apply that to humans. I think that humans bludgeoning themselves in bare-knuckle boxing, it has to do with the context in which they are made to bludgeon each other. And so I don't think you can separate the two. That's my point, is that we're creating violence, but the system is helping to create the mechanisms of violation that make that violence seem okay. Yeah, this is not about the pit bull. The temperament of the pit bull. It's about fighting.
Thank you.
Thank you.